Welcome. Welcome once again to Refill 100. Today we will be talking about philosophy and ecology. And the question that will be leading our conversation is this: is today's ecological crisis also a spiritual crisis? And this is how we start today. If you just look around to listen to the media or to see reality, you soon realize that we are facing problems that have to do with war, migration, terrorism, radicalism, inequality, intolerance, violence, and racism, among many others. Further, we also learn that we are dealing with socio-economic and well-being problems such as depression and burnout. And we are also experiencing social media and artificial intelligence instruments as subjects that, like it or not, are changing our emotions, feelings, and ways of reasoning and acting in private and public spheres. Besides, we are also witnessing how political parties and political leaders are losing moral authority and credibility, and how societies are getting divided and polarized. It is rather evident we are experiencing difficult times. Upon reflection, thinkers such as Stephen Batchelor and Fritz Hull have seen a connection between these situations and the ecological crisis that we are also facing today. In a way, they see the ecological crisis as a cry of the earth, telling us that our use, or rather misuse of natural resources, has reached scandalous and unacceptable levels and proportions. And yet, despite the evidence of the catastrophes that we are facing, we continue to ignore this crisis because of our short sightedness and egoism. As a result, climate change will continue to exacerbate migration flows and armed conflicts over the scarcity of water, land, and food supplies. All of this, of course, depicts a nil relationship with nature. It depicts an ecological crisis. Now, religion also plays a role in the ecological crisis that we are facing today. For example, migration is due in part to the fear that some people have to the way that Islam is practiced or interpreted in some Islamic countries and by some groups of believers. Likewise, political and economic problems in countries such as Brazil and El Salvador are very much connected to the support that Christian evangelism is given to political parties neoliberal policies, and justice practices. In line with this, scholars such as Lynn White Jr. have argued that the ecological crisis is an outcome of two main elements. First, the anthropocentrism promoted by Christianity, which is depicted in the Bible, especially in the book of Genesis, chapter 2. Second, the climate skepticism fostered by Christian conservative views that reject nature worship and autochthonous religions that see the earth as Pachamama. These views, as is commonly known, worry about the afterlife rather than about the planet and its future in history, in the life of today. All of this, hence, lead us to reflect on the place and role that religion is playing in today's society. And so, a question that now comes up to the fore is whether today's challenges and problems can be solved with more science and technology, or whether they are the symptoms of an underlying crisis of the entire system, including religion. Stephen Batchelor and Fritz Hull, as already mentioned before, interpret the ecological crisis as a spiritual crisis. Batchelor, for example, says that, and I quote, greed, hatred, and stupidity have spilled beyond the human mind and village politics to poison the seas, the air, and the earth itself. Quotation marks are closed. The ecological crisis, hence, is nothing else than a spiritual crisis of self-centered greed promoted by today's perspectives on technology. For its part, Fritz Hull claims that, and I open the quotation marks, the ecological crisis is preeminently a spiritual crisis of magnitude. Therefore, he continues, the resolution of such a crisis depends on a basic transformation of human hearts and minds. I closed quotation marks. We need spirituality, he says. We need a spirituality to have the wisdom, imagination, and strength needed to tackle this ecological crisis. In this context, he also adds, spirituality is connected to a collective experience of the numinous or sacred character of the earth and to an openness to the mystery of the universe. We need to have a vision of life with a sense of the sacred. This all, as already indicated, tell us that experiencing nature can be an essential source of spirituality. Now, the ecological crisis is spiritual because it is caused by what lives in our hearts and minds, and by what we find essential in life and what we strive for, and finally, by how we relate to nature and life. And of course, there are more examples that illustrate what it means to interpret the ecological crisis as a spiritual crisis. For instance, in his article, Greening the Faith, Paul Brockelman claims that, and I open quotation marks, the environmental is not just a spiritual issue, but rather the spiritual is the issue of our times. Close the quotation marks. And then Brockelman invites people to see the environment with new eyes as a spiritual issue. He also claims that the ecological deterioration is a matter of human attitudes towards the earth and life in general. Later on, Brockelman offers four reasons for the ecological crisis to be considered a spiritual crisis. This is the first reason. Today, nature is represented as something material without any intrinsic value. And then the consequence is that we can use nature and the raw materials the way that we want to do. Second reason, we all have a one-sided conception of the good life, which nowadays is equated to possessing as much stuff as possible. And of course, things would be rather different if we lived in a post-scarcity mentality. Third reason, natural science and regulation are not sufficient to eradicate the environmental problem. Rather, we also need a moral and a spiritual perspective. And finally, the fourth reason that Brockman gives is the ecological crisis enables a renewal and reformation of existing religious practices and traditions. Hence, the environment is a spiritual issue. Religious consciousness and new perspectives will help us to improve our present situation. This is why it is so important to consider the spiritual dimension of the world and nature with seriousness. But in addition to this, there are other cases, such as the case that Michael Norcott makes in his article, Case of Creation. In that article, Norcott says that our devotion to consumerism is leading to today's environmental destruction. Consumption, he says, is a spiritual disease that feeds with idolatry or the worship of what is not God. Nature is not just raw material. It has intrinsic value, even apart from humankind. Consumerism and materialism are the expression of a deep spiritual malaise. Finally, in his spiritual and religious dimension of the environmental crisis, Sayyid Hossein Nas says that the ecological crisis is or has a spiritual and religious dimension. And this is because it was caused by modern humans forgetting perennial truths. He also says this crisis cannot be solved by better technology or adjustments to our economic system. Only a transformation of our consciousness will be able to turn the tide. We can only tackle the ecological crisis if we reconnect with the traditional experience of nature as sacred presence. And so, at the end of this short reflection, we conclude that today ecological crisis is indeed also a spiritual crisis. And indeed, if we want to solve it, we need to restore a religious perspective of nature where we appreciate its intrinsic value rather than staying at the instrumental value fostered by today's economic and technological policies. Dear friends, this is all for today. I hope that we continue reflecting on these matters that are of great importance. See you in the next program. All the best to you. Goodbye now.